Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. Hey everybody, welcome back to MedTech Speed to Data. I'm your host, Andy Rogers. We have two guests on the show today. First guest, Zong, Director of Strategy here at KeyTech. Lei, this is your second time on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And we have Jason Brooke on the episode as well. He's worn many hats over his career. Started out as an engineer, went to law school, and started his own company. And now he's starting a second company as a lawyer, regulatory consultant. Jason, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So the topic today was sparked by a LinkedIn post Jason posted about the FDA's new guidance on AI with medical devices. So we're going to bring Jason's expertise from a legal perspective. But as I mentioned, he's an entrepreneur and engineer, so he's going to bring that perspective as well. So Jason, before we get into it, give our audience a little bit of a rundown of who you are and what you've been doing these days.
Yeah, sure. So, I've been in the medical device industry for 20 plus years now in various capacities, as you said. So I started out early on in my career as a scientist engineer. So I did my undergrad in bioengineering at Maryland, went to Johns Hopkins for biomedical engineering grad school. Then I went into industry working for a large medical device company as a scientist, developing algorithms for pacemakers, defibrillators, and other cardiac rhythm management devices. And there I kind of honed my skills, got a lot of training in medical device development, honed my skills in software development and running clinical trials, preclinical trials, et cetera. But then became a lawyer. I went to the University of Maryland School of Law to practice law and helping medical device companies understand the legal, regulatory, quality, compliance requirements, because a lot of people think about technology development in the medical device space and very heavily focused on the technology, which is obviously very important. But that has to be done under a compliance framework. And those compliance requirements are legal requirements. And so bringing or marrying my science technology background and experience with my legal experience, I'm able to, or at least my goal is to help medical device companies understand what those requirements are and how to operationalize the requirements, meaning not just say, okay, here's what the guidance says, or here's what the legal or regulatory requirement is, but rather say, okay, this is how you can implement this in your company. And so really my focus is to marry those two different disciplines in order to help companies get their products to market and then stay out of trouble when they do, right? A lot of times companies will get their 510K clearance, everyone gets really excited, and then they go off and market and do all the things they're not supposed to do. And so I try to help prevent that. But then when that happens and the law comes knocking, I try to help mitigate some of the risk there. As you said, I also bring the entrepreneurial perspective. So along the way of being a lawyer and practicing law, I started a medical device company called VasOptic Medical, which is a Baltimore-based medical device company focused on it's a Hopkins spin-out. So we took a technology that my business partner developed in a PhD program at Hopkins Biomedical Engineering, which is a laser-based vascular imaging technology. We adapted it for use in retinal imaging for the purposes of helping to identify various disease conditions by looking at changes in blood flow patterns in the retina and kind of correlating them to potential disease conditions, because a lot of diseases have symptomology or physiological changes that are observable in the blood vessels of the retina.
Thanks, Jason. That's great background. Before we get into the episode, AI wasn't really around, right, when you started VasOptic, and certainly when you and Lei were at College Park. I won't mention the year. So it's almost like a different industry looking forward. So can you just, for our audience, provide some recent case studies, your experience with AI from your legal perspective, maybe, what types of devices and what are those products using AI for?
Sure. So as a practice, we are kind of technology agnostic and clinical domain agnostic, meaning all medical devices of all types, whether it has AI or not, whether you're talking about imaging technology or as diagnostic technology or some type of therapeutic is irrelevant to us in that we support all types of technologies. Today, our practice is probably 80+% of it has AI involved. So you're absolutely right. Just a few years ago, technologies that we were working with, clients we were working with, didn't really rely on AI-based models as a part of the algorithm development. But now it's the vast majority of our technologies, and it ranges as you would expect. If you look at the data at the FDA publishes a long list. I think there's like 900 plus AI-based products that have gone through the FDA, and they'll publish the kind of the domain, the therapeutic domain that they're in, and the vast majority, I think, well over 500 of them are in radiological imaging. And the radiological imaging group at the FDA has had the longest history with AI-based technologies. And so we have supported clients in the radiological imaging space. The next most significant area, if you look at the FDA's public data, is in cardiovascular imaging, cardiovascular devices. So like ECG type algorithms that are looking for patterns in the ECG signal. That makes up kind of the next largest group, if I remember correctly, and we do work in that space. Certainly, early event detection is something that's really critical from a clinical perspective, and so there's a lot of different AI-based technologies out there that are trying to look for different types of changes in the ECG signal to identify various types of cardiac events that may occur, and obviously do that early so that the clinician can be aware and or prevent it from occurring. But we do a lot also in kind of mental health space. Done some work in the dental imaging space. So it's really across the board these days. But if you look at the data purely on the number of AI-based applications that have gone through the FDA, it drops off quickly when you move from radiological imaging to cardiology, and then the tail is really long. And I think that's true of just kind of the maturity of AI in other areas within the FDA device space.
Yeah, just a real quick follow up from that. Which ones do you think are coming up right behind those? Like, would you say, or is it like a race?
I mean, I think neurological areas and mental health is certainly something that's big, both from a clinical perspective, but just like with looking at signal or patterns in ECG signals, you can look in patterns in EEG signals, for example, to try to identify certain disease conditions. Pointing back to VasOptic, we generate a lot of data around vascular blood flow patterns in the microvasculature, and so there's a lot of information that you can look for and try to extract clinically meaningful information there. So it's not necessarily radiological imaging per se; it's more in ophthalmology space. But I think we're going to start seeing all clinical domains increasing their AI-based technologies. At the end of the day, like I said, a radiological imaging group within the FDA has had the longest history, just because it's the application of AI in imaging technology has been around the longest. And so certainly the data is going to bear that out, that the radiological imaging group has the vast majority of those types of applications that have gone through.
Yeah, Jason, that is such a great overview of AI enabled technology. I agree. I think I saw that. I don't know the specific number, but the percentage of image based AI enabled technology is overwhelming, right? And it's great to hear like cardiovascular diagnostic is sort of following that. I guess just curious to get your take. AI is great for image based detection diagnostics. And there's a wealth of data available to train on that. Sort of the same case or very similar case in the cardiovascular, group of applications. And do you see, like, what are the biggest factor, after those two main groups for the upcoming ones? What are the biggest challenges you see for those categories? Is that the availability of data that you can train the model? Is that the, expertise there's some unique aspect in those categories that's not quite the same as these two groups, or is that, the FDA's experience in clearing these devices? What are your thoughts in some of those?
I think the cardiovascular group within FDA, and as a footnote, when I say FDA, I'm really talking about the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, because I don't do anything outside of that space. But the cardiovascular group within the FDA certainly is sophisticated when it comes to the AI-based technologies, and they've been involved in it quite a long time now. The physiological signals are also, as I said, they're right for AI-based analysis, much like radiological imaging is. And so, I think that the cardiovascular group and the technologies in the cardiovascular domain and monitoring domain there's a rapid uptick in those types of AI-based technologies. Now, the challenge that's maybe slightly different from radiological imaging that these cardiovascular and neuro-based AI technologies have, not just the access to data, but the signal generators are very different from one hospital to the next. And so unlike, say, an MRI or ultrasound or CT device that produces maybe a pretty standard image, right? They use DICOM based imaging files. ECG monitors, bedside monitors might have different degrees of filtering or sample frequency or other types of technological characteristics about that are embedded in the signal itself that may make an AI-based software algorithm susceptible to failures or biases or things of that nature. And so we've had experience actually engaging with the FDA, where the FDA is particularly concerned about the signal generators and bedside monitors, right? The ECG monitors, for example, the number of different models that are used as to generate the source data that the AI models are evaluating. And when I say models with respect to the ECG, I'm talking about different types, makes, models of ECG monitors, right? So, pick your large medical device company, whether it's, Johnson & Johnson or Medtronic or what have you. I don't even know if Medtronic makes ECG monitors, but point being is that there's different manufacturers of ECG monitors. And what the FDA is concerned about is that inherent in each of those products, those signal generators, is certain degree of error, certain degree of technological characteristics that could affect the downstream AI model that's analyzing the signal. And so characterizing the input to the AI model is really important. And that's not something that's as critical in the radiological imaging space. So I think that's something that a lot of people think, well, the bedside monitor is cleared by the FDA. It's gotten, it's got 510(k) clearance. So why do we care about, what the signal generators are? But the FDA cares because there's inherent uniqueness to each of those bedside monitors that have to be considered when you're evaluating the performance of an AI model that's analyzing those signals.
That's interesting. That's certainly very valuable insight. It sounds like there's just a level of pre-processing or signal filtering that's done on each device that's just not standard, and that can bias. Yeah, so your AI models is not getting the true raw data as our engineers like to think about it, right? So the bias.
There's another important aspect to understanding or to think about when you're looking at, say, a physiological signal as opposed to radiological image, is that there's a lot of extra information that you need to know about the patient that may or may not be available when you're building your AI model, right? And so, you might not think, well, you might say, okay, well, I'm looking at an ECG signal. Why do I care about patient's BMI or the patient's race or other characteristics about the patient? But those are critical elements to the understanding of whether the AI model is safe and effective. And so the FDA is going to ask about those things. And so if you're looking at, for example, if you're using a retrospective data set, to build and test your AI model, the data set may not be acceptable to the FDA because it may not have all the data elements that are needed. It might have awesome ECG signals, and it may have ECG signals from a variety of different bedside monitors, but the additional data that is needed about the patient may not be available, and that may make it difficult to understand the potential sources of bias in the AI model, and it may make it difficult for the company to get the product through the FDA.
So just to follow up on that commentary, I agree. The data is disparate depending on the condition, depending on the patient, the environment, and how the medical device is being used, right? So how do these companies get past that? Is there a simple way to do that? Maybe just lowering the sensitivity of whatever the AI is supposed to do to account for that variation and kind of just get cleared that way and then hope to have more precision later? Or is that the strategy?
So that's a great question. This is an area that is a little bit of a soapbox for me in regard to the FDA's expectations and whether or not they're reasonable. So when a company performs their clinical validation testing, whether on a retrospective or prospective data set, analyzes data and presents kind of the performance characteristics of the AI model, the FDA will ask for subgroup analyses, or what many people call sensitivity analyses, that are looking at certain subgroups within the patient population that are of interest. And there's how you define of interest is kind of a bit nebulous at this point, but they may ask for things like, well, okay, what if you have different groups of BMI? How does that impact your algorithm's performance? Or age? Maybe at 20 to 30 may perform differently than 65 to 75. Or heart rates, if you're talking about ECG, maybe your AI model does a great job in kind of normal resting heart rate ranges, but not in tachycardia or bradycardia. And so there is an expectation from the FDA's perspective that you do these types of subgroup analyses. And if your population-based performance is acceptable, but subgroup analyses have kind of varying degree of performance, then the FDA will look to limit the claims that you're going to make about the product in those subgroups. So you might have to, in your labeling, provide some information about limitations on the performance of your AI model in those various subgroups that I was just mentioning as an examples, right? Maybe you say, well, in people over 65, this is the performance may be degraded, right? Now, the reason why you have to qualify it as may be degraded is because, and this gets to my soapbox, is that the sensitivity analyses that the FDA is asking for are not powered statistically. And so you don't really know when you look at these subgroup analyses whether and to what extent the performance and the performance metrics that you're seeing are meaningful. So you may have an overall population sensitivity specificity of 90% plus, right? But in a particular subgroup, maybe it's 80%. But the study isn't powered for that subgroup purpose. The confidence interval around that 80% may be pretty wide. And so it could be really good or it could be really bad, but you don't really know. And so you can't make a conclusion around that. But the FDA wants to see those data and those subgroup analyses so that they can evaluate whether there's a potential source of bias. And that's where these labeling claims discussions come about, because there is a potential source of bias in theory, and the FDA wants disclosure to patients and users on that. If your overall performance, population-based performance, is on the lower end, then certainly you would be negotiating with the FDA to try to either do some post-market analysis that would potentially or modifications that would potentially improve your performance, or maybe you adjust your sensitivity up and your specificity down, or positive predictive value in one direction, negative predictive value in another. It really kind of depends on the clinical application and the specific technology, what's the use case and what's meaningful, false positives or false negatives. So there is some room to kind of modify and adjust performance expectations, and certainly negotiating with the FDA is something that you should consider in that area. But that's how clients or companies are getting through the FDA, is to really one, develop a really strong clinical validation plan, and then two, ideally have performance that meets expectations. And then if it doesn't, either overall or in a subgroup, really kind of work with or negotiate with the FDA of adjusting those expectations so that so that the model meets acceptance criteria. I think the bottom line, though, is there's two elements that have to be met, and the FDA expects you to do. One is statistical meaningfulness in the overall population, and two is clinical meaningfulness, right? So you might say, okay, well, our performance target for our overall, for the AI model and the overall population that we're targeting is 85% sensitivity and specificity, right? And you might be awesome at hitting that 85%. The FDA may say, well, there's these other products over here that have 95%. So your 85% isn't clinically meaningful because there's these other products that are doing a way better job in identifying whatever it is you're trying to identify. And so, sure, statistically, you may be very powerful, but clinically, you might not be. And I think that's something that a lot of companies don't really think about is what is the clinical meaning of the results that you're getting when you're doing your performance analysis.
Very true, Jason. All right, I want to change gears a little bit. I think our audience wants to learn more about the AI guidance from the FDA. So clearly, it's risk-based. They provide a framework for managing risks. Other standards do that as well. So can you describe the standard in your eyes and maybe the context of the client work you're doing and advising clients on how to meet the standard?
Yeah, sure. So first, let me say is that the guidance is a draft guidance, and which means that there's an opportunity to provide feedback to the FDA to improve the guidance, add clarity and certain. And I am actively preparing comments in that regard. Overall, I would say that the guidance is really well written, which isn't always the case, but this one, they obviously spent a lot of time and they had some really good experts involved in preparing this draft guidance. I would say a lot of the information that's there is not surprising, and it's not really any different if you think about it at a higher level from what we do today with other non-AI based medical devices. Right? The framework is the same. The expectations at a high level are the same, and it's really in the weeds that are important. And you got to kind of the unique aspects of labeling or study design or things of that nature that are specific to AI. That's where this guidance kind of gets into the weeds and is important for companies to understand if they're developing an AI-based product. So the way this guidance is structured, which is somewhat unique, I would say, is essentially it goes through, two things. One is it looks at it from a total product lifecycle perspective. A lot of guidance documents are either pre-market focused or post-market focused, and it says, okay, here's what you need to do to get your product through the FDA, or once your product's in the market, here are the things that you need to worry about. The AI guidance, probably because it's intended to, in the future, allow for adaptive AI models. This guidance is really focused on a total product lifecycle approach. In the pre-market context, so for purposes of getting your product into the market, what this guidance does, or the way it's structured, is say, okay, here, if you're looking at a 510K, for example, here are all the elements of what you need to submit in a 510K submission. So this is the AI specific stuff you need to provide, and here's where we would expect to see it in your 510K submission, whether it's in the software documentation or the risk management documentation or in the labeling or what have you, which I think is a really helpful way to convey FDA's expectations, right? It helps companies understand where in a 510K submission package does this information need to go. When it comes to substance, I just give you a quick overview. They talk about things that they want to see in the device description. So, for example, what is the intended use of the product, which is you have to do in every submission, right? It's not new. What's the use environment? What are the clinical workflows that you expect? What's a little different about AI is from traditional medical devices is that the FDA wants to understand the development process. With a traditional hardware device, that particularly the 510 for a 510K submission, the development process it's governed by the good manufacturing practices, and so development information about the manufacturing or the development isn't as critical in a 510K submission. Sure, you have to provide verification, validation test results, and things of that nature. But for example, you don't need to provide the qualifications of the engineer who did the CAD drawing for the hardware, right? But in the AI context, the FDA wants to understand what is who were the individuals involved in the data cleansing activities, in the training activities, in the validation activities, and what are their qualifications? If you have an individual who's labeling data, annotating images, for example, are they medical students? Are they retired radiologists? Are they board certified active radiologists? How many of them? Where are they from? Are they from Joe Schmo University or are they from Johns Hopkins University, right? Like that's a level of information that we haven't really had to provide to the FDA before. And that's really necessary in submissions with the FDA for AI-based technologies. The labeling, they talk about a lot of information they want to see in the labeling. And I think this is an area where there may be some pushback, and certainly I'll be making comments around how much information you need to present to the FDA and in what form in the labeling. And obviously the labeling is publicly available information. And so this is information that may go to patients and providers and hospital administrators and others. So there's a lot of information the FDA expects to see, particularly around performance characteristics, sources of bias, things of that nature. Risk assessment documentation is really important in the submission. So the FDA spends a good bit of time talking about doing risk assessment and kind of indicating there that they want you to look at what are the unique aspects of AI that are risky and make sure that's incorporated. Data management is a critical element. So the FDA spends a good bit about talking about data management practices and the fact that they want to understand the information they want to see information about your data management practices, as I was just mentioning, but not just who's involved, but the independence of data sets are really critical. So the FDA makes it very clear there should be no training data in your validation data set, right? And the FDA goes so far as even to say you shouldn't have clinical sites that are crossing over from training data sets to your validation data sets. So you need to have completely independent clinical sites. In some cases, they may ask for temporal separation, meaning you have to have your data set that you're using to train your model has to be a certain time period away from when you're collecting data for your validation testing data set. And so details around these aspects of data management are really critical. Obviously, there's generalizability aspects around the patient population that are being evaluated, but what's a little bit unique again about AI as compared to traditional medical devices is that the FDA is not just looking for generalizability in the data set of patients, but also in clinical providers that are involved and the geographies in which the clinical sites are. So they may ask for, they may not accept a data set that's based on, large academic institutions in New England, in the New England region only. They may want a site from a smaller facility in rural Alabama or Montana, and they might want someone Southern California. And so they've made clear that they expect at least 3 clinical sites in the data set to allow for generalizability in that sense. But there's a little more nuance that they're going to be looking for as well when it comes to that aspect. Couple other important elements, certainly describing the model as best you can in as much detail as you can, and any sources of bias or limitations associated with that is critical. They want to hear about the validation methodologies that are used. That's obviously very critical. Human factors may be relevant depending on the situation. And then at the end of the day, the device performance is super critical. I mentioned earlier about kind of population-based performance metrics, but also subgroup or sensitivity analyses are going to be important. That's an area, given my soapbox, that I'll be commenting. I'm not sure they'll care about my comments, but I'll at least be making them known. And then cybersecurity interoperability is another piece that's really important. And then the last bit is in the guidance, they talk about what do they expect in the public-facing documentation. So like your 510K summary or your de novo summary. And they want a lot of information, all of that performance data, the subgroup analyses they've asked for in this draft guidance. That's an area I think may be problematic because a lot of that is somewhat trade secret, or at least some of the processes, and we'll see where that ends up in the final guidance when it comes out, if and when it comes out. But they're certainly asking for a lot of information in not just the labeling, but also in these public facing documents.
Lei, this sounds like it rhymes with 62304.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, there's definitely a lot of similarities, on the software side. My background is in software development, so very familiar with 62304. Jason, as you mentioned, not every single FDA guidance document looks for that whole life cycle, but 62304 is one. So we pay a lot of attention to that. But and then there's sections where the client have to focus, the developers have to focus, so that people may focus on different portion of 62304. But it sounds like for this AI draft guidance, at least there's a lot more detail than you typically see in the FDA guidance. I think it's a great crash course you just provided here, but it's also a little surprising they will call out the minimum number of clinical sites that you have to do, which is certainly like a good or could be challenging thing, but I do like to see more details in the FDA guidance. It also sounds very comprehensive, which is a great thing for FDA to push out those guidance.
I mean, one thing that's going to be I see that I didn't see in the study in this guidance is something I see when I engage with the FDA and I get questions from a lot of clients is around OUS data versus US data. For those listening, an unwritten policy of the FDA is that 51% of the data that are used to evaluate the performance is expected to come from US-based data sets. And so for companies that are OUS, that can be hard, right? Running a clinical trial in the United States is expensive. And so there are companies that may have CE marking in EU for the AI-based product, and when they want to come to the United States, they struggle with getting through the FDA. Now, certainly, you can justify why having more than 51% being OUS, and if the FDA buys your justification, that's great. But their starting point is they expect to see 51% of data coming from US patient population, and that can be problematic for a lot of early stage companies. But to your point about 62304, absolutely right. I mean, FDA looks in recent years has looked favorably upon these standards like 62304, 14971, number of other IC and ISO standards, and I would encourage people to look to them as well as they develop their medical devices.
Yeah. It almost sounds like FDA is building its own AI models based on all the information they're asking here.
Well, they were until recently, where a lot of the AI-based experts within the agency were let go from, and so thankfully, many of them have been rehired, but there were a lot of people who were hired in the last year or two because the FDA was ramping up their AI capabilities, and both for internal development, there's a lot of internal AI development that's going on at the agency, but also to be experts in reviews of products that are being submitted for pre-market review by the agency.
All right, we're getting close to time here. We've kind of gone off script. That's what happens, and I think it's totally fine. We talked about the standard. Jason, you shared some of the experience you have in industry. Jason, given your entrepreneurial background, what advice do you have for startup companies, global companies even, that are looking to develop AI-enabled products? if they're starting now, like what would you recommend?
A lot of planning. One of the things that I know software developers struggle with is kind of the slow and steady wins the race mentality. I think that's true here. There's a need to ensure that the work that you're going to do is going to be accepted by the FDA. And a lot of times people come to me and to the FDA with something that's they believe to be fully baked and ready to go. And the FDA looks at it and says, well, you don't have this, you don't have that. You need to do this analysis. You need to provide this information. And they don't have it. And they have to go back and redo it. I have clients who've been kind of dealing with that for literally years. And I think that the kryptonite to that is early planning, getting someone who understands what the FDA's expectations are to advise you, and then engage with the FDA, right? I always tell clients, look, I can get you 95% of the way there, but at the end of the day, the FDA is the one that you have to satisfy, not me. And so to get to 100%, as it relates to answering a particular question about the process and their expectations, you got to go talk to the FDA. So Q-Sub meetings with the FDA are important. A lot of people in the FDA will say engage early and often. I don't know that I give that advice. I tend to say do a lot of work internally, do your homework, get your ducks in a row, and then at the right time, on the earlier side, but at the right time, engage with the FDA, make sure the FDA understands what you're trying to do, is on board with your approach before you go down the road of doing a lot of work that would potentially have to be reverse engineered and redone.
That's great advice. Hey, Lei, any other questions for Jason?
Not from me. I'm almost excited to read this standard. It sounds like a page turner.
I don't know that an FDA guidance has ever been called a page turner, but for those of us like us, we'll probably very much enjoy it.
All right, Jason, I have another final question for you. Maybe this is too simple, but what is the value of AI in these devices? To me, it's accelerating time to market, more sensitivity on existing systems, diagnostics, therapeutic devices, and things like that. What's the value in your mind?
I think early prediction in being able to identify patterns that are not obvious in either an image or a signal of some sort, or behaviors that you can't necessarily see with your own eye, if you will, right? Or aren't so obvious. AI is really powerful in pulling those patterns out and identifying them as something meaningful. Now, obviously, you need humans to explain to the AI model what's meaningful about it, but the ability to extract somewhat undetectable patterns from data is where I see AI being very powerful. But not all devices need to be AI based. And there's a lot of burden. If you take away anything from this podcast, it's that there's a lot of burden associated with developing an AI-based medical device. And if you don't need to, then I wouldn't recommend doing it.
It's interesting. My wife just had x-rays at the dentist this week. She's 42 years old. Hey, Mel. The AI found 5 cavities. So she's got 5 cavities thanks to the AI. So they're putting work in already.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And similarly, when you get mammograms, they're already advocating for these AI tools to be used to view your images, etc. So I think it's going to get a lot more widespread use into everyday tasks. Like Jason said, I mean, what AI is good for is prediction. It's going to change the market from that perspective. So I think on the medical side, wherever we can benefit from better prediction, that's where you probably will see growth in AI-enabled technology.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, though. So the age-old question of ethics, right? So the earlier you can predict something, what do you do with that information? Clearly, it increases anxiety. But if there's no treatment, the question is there a net positive gain there? Jason, Lei, thank you so much for coming on MedTech Speed to Data. Until next time, I'm Andy, signing off. See ya.
Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.